Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you so much for joining this webinar. So let's get started with the new ISO. But before I start, I'd like to ask a fun question. What is the relationship between ISO 15189 and chameleons? I guess they all look different every time you look at them. I don't know how many times I've looked at the ISO standard, but every time I look at the ISO standard, I find it look different with the old standard. Even with the new standard, I have read it many times, and every time I read the new standard, it just looks so different to me. So main consideration for the new ISO was published on December 2022. It is patient focused, risk-based. I think you're going to hear the word risk a lot in the new ISO. So in the old ISO, the 15189-2012, the word risk was used about 12 times. In the new ISO, it was used more than 80 times. So clearly, we need to expand our knowledge when it comes to area of risk assessment and risk management, risk mitigation, and how to deal with residual risk. The structure of the new ISO is aligned with the ISO 17025, which is a parent document for the 15189. And in turn, the ISO 17025 is aligned with the ISO 9001. So now all the three ISOs are aligned in terms of structure. If you look at the left side of the screen, the ISO 15189-2012, it consists of introduction, scope, normative reference, term and definitions, management requirement, and technical requirement. However, in the right side of the screen, you have the new ISO, which the section 4 clause 4 and clause 5 now consist of 5 different clauses. So you have clause 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So clearly, we really need to restructure our quality management system. We need to restructure our quality manual to meet the new requirement from ISO. And to meet the changes for the standard. Again, as we are all familiar with the old ISO, we have management requirement, which is usually handled by the QA team. And the technical requirement, most of the time, it's handled by the technical team, maybe exception of 5.1 and 5.10. Many times those are non-technical department, which we in the QA department tend to work with them to ensure compliance, but the rest is usually handled by the technical teams and the technical assessor. And this is the structure of the new ISO. So the new ISO clause 4 is a general requirement that discuss impartiality, confidentiality. And then clause 5 is structure and governance requirement, anywhere from legal entity to lab director and risk management. Clause 6, any resource that we need to run our lab, from personnel to equipment, reagent, service agreement. Clause 7, all the processes we have in our lab, it's tend to be a little bit technical. So it covers the pre-examination, examination, post-examination, and non-conforming work. Clause 8, we have the management system requirement. And if you notice here, I think preventive action is no longer there, and the preventive action clauses were replaced with risk assessment and risk management. So you will not see any more anything related to preventive action in the new ISO. So in this presentation, since I have maybe 55 minutes or so, I will cover everything you see here in red. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll have a series of presentation or webinars where we will dissect each one of those in details, but now it's just a quick overview. So I'll just quickly touch on anything you see here in red and just highlight you the major changes. Maybe you can start working on it. As you heard a few minutes ago from Khawla, the timeline is tight. I think by the end of this year, we need to be in compliance with the standard. So next year, you will be assessed with the new standard. So let's start with a quick introduction first. Just a reminder, what is shall and what is should. I think we all know shall indicates a requirement and should indicates a recommendation. The technical committee, when they discussed this, and I attended few webinars, that was organized by the technical committee 212, which is a technical committee responsible for the new ISO. They said now the term shall and should were no longer part of the note section of the standard. It has been elevated to the main part of the clause. So you can no longer be surprised with an inspector or assessor just highlighting to you in the note section that the laboratory shall. So it has been, it's moved up to the main clause of the standard. One thing to remember, whenever you see should, people tend to forget about it and they don't implement it in your lab. And if you don't implement any should statement in your lab, the recommendation is you need to have justification statement why you ignored it. So any should, it's there in the standard. If you don't do it, just write in your policy why you're not doing it and why you think your practice is basically of a good quality and you do not have to do the to follow the should statement in the ISO standard. So as I mentioned, you have clause 4 through 8. So let's start with clause 4. So in clause 4, we have more complete coverage in the area of confidentiality. They have added more information regarding management of information. So consent is an example for that. Infectious disease reporting. So if you're going to report infectious disease to authority, maybe we should notify or we should let the patient ahead of time that the result will be shared with the authorities. And for consent, I notice many of you also working in genetics labs. Of course, with genetics, many times those samples can be used for diagnostic, but it can reflect into research sometimes. Maybe we want to ensure that we take consent for patients. And one of the KPIs I like here is I like to see how many sample received for those research and how many consent we have. And we want to make sure that we ensure 100% compliance, of course, with the consenting process. Release of information is also an area of interest to the new ISO. And I think the question we had in our task force is, can we give patient the results? And actually, across Europe, most of our QA team there, they said the answer is no. We should not give the patient the results. We should only give it to the doctors. And I think the same apply to the US, unless it's a direct-to-consumer testing. But I notice outside of Europe and the US, many laboratories are giving the patients directly to the results, which might not be the best practice because maybe a positive infectious disease result can mean life or death to a patient, and they can do anything to themselves. So definitely we need to review the local regulation if we can give the patient their results. Also, personnel responsibilities. A contractor and assessor, as we have a number of contractors walk through our laboratories, we want to make sure that they sign some sort of a confidentiality agreement because they can walk through the lab, they have access to our instrument, all the tests, they have access to it, they can hear our conversation, so we want to make sure that they keep the information confidential, as well as the assessors. So many times when we have assessor, we ask them to sign a confidentiality agreement, even though the accreditation bodies will ask the assessor to sign the confidentiality agreement as well. So generally in this area, we really need to read more about HIPAA in the US, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, and maybe we can implement part of those regulations in our setting around the globe. In terms of specification, just one second, I want to use the pointer. Okay. So in terms of a specification of process for ensuring patient well-being, there's 9 different processes that are added now with the new ISO that definitely need to be addressed and make sure that we're in compliance with those patient well-being requirement. The biggest change in clause 4 is impartiality. So there's now a requirement to commit to and safeguard impartiality to avoid conflict of interest. So the question is, what is impartiality? Impartiality is a procedure that describes the measure taken to safeguard and promote objectivity, independence, fairness, lack of prejudice, neutrality, detachment, balance, freedom from conflict of interest, bias. Basically, impartiality is doing the right thing. So we want to make sure that we do the right thing. So in clause 4.1 related to impartiality, A, there's a requirement to safeguard impartiality. We need to commit to impartiality. So commitment is just not a matter of writing it in our quality manual or in our impartial or in our ethics SOP, but we need to prove, we need to show that we really committed to impartiality, and I'll explain to you in the next slide how we can do that. We shall not allow commercial, financial, or other pressure to compromise impartiality. And of course, the finance team, the procurement team are the department that we usually look at when we come to assessing impartiality. We want to make sure that they follow the process in terms of maybe 3 bidders, maybe technical specification, to make sure that we really, when we purchase a product or laboratory, we did not purchase it for any reason other than being the best product that fit our need. If there's any threat identified that can have impact impartiality, it should be eliminated or minimized. So I think when we look at the word minimize and in impartiality, we attended a workshop last month by CLSI. And when this clause came, many of us didn't understand how do you minimize threats. And I think the example that was brought up during that workshop, if I have a relationship with a vendor and I'm part of a technical committee, I can just declare that I can exclude myself from the committee, and but by doing that, I will minimize threat or having any conflict of interest. So that was a good example I think we had during that workshop. Some of the tips, if you look at the bottom left of the screen, there's a number of training that many of you have attended, especially if you're working in a government organization or semi-government or big reputable organization. You will go through anti-retaliation training, conflict of interest, whistleblowing, speaking up training. I think all of that will help you ensure that you are safeguard impartialities. The way I'm looking at it, setting the right governance structure will safeguard impartiality. So for example, with the new ISO standard, there is no requirement for a quality manager. So we no longer have to have a quality manager. So I would assume most of the small labs will have somebody with a dual responsibilities where they have to manage the operation and quality at the same time. My concern here, I want to make sure that the reporting line for that person in the area of operation, it can go, of course, to the pathologist or to a technical director. But for the QA responsibility, we just want to make sure that the QA have sort of a dotted line to a higher authority where decisions are made. So maybe to a CEO level or to a board level. And by doing so, we will ensure that we safeguard impartiality and that person can highlight any risk to the higher authorities within the organization. Basically, when it comes to impartiality, we need to review the process from receiving samples to results reporting to ensure impartiality. We need to avoid conflict of interest. If a vendor is sending the entire management team to a conference somewhere overseas, and then when they come back, they have to make a decision about a tendering process, I don't think that will be the best process in place. So we need to have maybe a corporate compliance department to review those requests from the management team and to make sure that people are doing the right things and they will not just accept donation or accept sponsorship from vendors, because then maybe their decision can be impacted. We should not audit our own areas, again, to safeguard impartiality. Complaint process and complaint resolution, if there's a complaint against a particular individual, that individual should not be part of the complaint investigation process. Maybe he can be just answer question, but the final complaint need to be reviewed and done by somebody different than the person who were complained against. Employment of relatives and so on. So I think we'll provide more example when we cover this I think in May. We'll share with you more example what we think you need to do to be in compliance with this one. But generally, the way I'm looking at it, I think writing a policy about impartiality will be helpful. And then in that policy, we can discuss the training that we do. We can discuss how we ensure and safeguard impartiality in the finance department, in the procurement department, in the org chart. I think by explaining all of this, that will help our staff understand impartiality and will help assessors see the fact that we are already in compliance with the impartiality. Moving on to clause 5, lab director. So now they remove the requirement, or they remove the list of the responsibilities of the lab director, and they replace this with the phrase or by stating that the duties and responsibilities of the lab director shall be documented. I think the College of American Pathologists have done a better job here in terms of the lab director responsibilities. So if you look at the general checklist, the all common checklist and the lab director checklist, usually all those responsibilities will be listed there, and what can be delegated also will be listed. and delegated to who also will be written in the checklist. So some responsibility can be delegated to a technical supervisor, some responsibility can be delegated to any designee who's qualified, and so on. I think it's recommended from my side to look into those checklists when you look into the lab director responsibility, to ensure that when we do delegate, we delegate to the person with the right competency. Next clause here, so they remove the requirement for a quality manager. However, those responsibilities can be assigned to one or more person, and they need to have the authority and resources for the management system duties. So basically, you don't have to have somebody with the name quality manager, but somebody maybe can be in charge of quality. And if you notice here, the ISO start using the word management system. So in the old ISO, they were using the terminology quality management system, but now everywhere you see in the ISO, they will just use the management system. So the word quality have been dropped. I know that will not go well with CLSI, because CLSI usually use the terminology quality management system, but I think now it's slightly different between ISO and CLSI in terms of terminology used when it comes to describe management system within laboratories. Clause 5.6, that's the beginning of risk assessment and risk management. So when it comes to risk, as I mentioned, the term risk was used 12 times in the old ISO and 85 times in the new ISO. So it's all over the place. In the left side of the screen, you have the general risk concept. And then on the right side of the screen, specific risk concept. So clearly we need to upgrade our knowledge in the area of risk, risk management, risk mitigation, and to be in compliance with all of this, I'm thinking of two different ways. Of course, in addition to use some of the risk assessment tools, we need to write it maybe in a policy format, or maybe it can be part of a quality manual. I'm still debating where would be the best place to address all of those, but I think addressing them in a document, it will be a good idea. So at least when an assessor comes to your lab, they will see how are you addressing all those type of risk in your laboratory, and even the staff will understand how are we addressing all those risk-related activities or risk-related concern in your laboratory. In the ISO, the new ISO, there is no requirement for any particular risk management method. So the ISO recommended the use of 22367, application of risk management to medical laboratories, and they also recommend the use of 35001, biorisk management for laboratories and other related organizations. From my side, I felt more comfortable with the document on the right side of the screen, EP18 from CLSI, Risk Management Techniques to Identify and Control Laboratory Errors sources. And I just used it actually a couple of months ago when we installed the digital pathology scanner in our lab, and I found it very helpful because the backside of this document, it listed all the potential risk that can happen to your instrument and to your equipment. So all we need to do is just select from this list what can be applicable to our setting and how we can mitigate this risk. So it was organized, I think, in a way it was divided into pre-analytic, analytic, post-analytic phase of testing and all those risks, which it's very helpful, I think, to assess risk in your laboratory. Another good document that I like to use when it comes to risk management is EP23. This document was published back in 2011 by CLSI. And they kind of put risk into 5 different categories: risk related to samples, and of course you can read the subcategories here. Risk related to operators, reagents, environment, and measuring system. So I think this document is also a good source which can help us all understand risk assessment and risk management. I think the combination of EP23 and EP18 together at the beginning will be a good start. And then maybe eventually we need to adapt the 2 ISO standard as well. And by looking at all those 4 documents together, I'm very sure we'll have a very robust risk management system in our laboratory. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll do some risk management webinar, I think scheduled somewhere around August or September, where we will dissect those documents. We'll spend maybe an hour or an hour and a half explaining to you how we can do risk assessment, risk management, and hopefully you can adapt what we will share with you into your setting. Also in the ISO, they even ask us if we have any residual risk, it shall be communicated to user as appropriate. So if we did the risk assessment, we did the risk mitigation, yet there's a residual risk, it needs to be communicated to the user. So this is an ISO 7.1. So I thought I'll share with you an example from our laboratory, an email that was sent by our customer care team to our customers during the holiday season. And basically, we say due to the upcoming holiday season and current weather condition, some shipment may face delay in delivery, which could affect sample stability. In order to avoid rejection, we recommend avoiding sample collection for low stability test between December 21st and January 1st. We will resume regular shipping days starting 2nd of January. So basically, there's a residual risk. Maybe there's a medical necessity for our clients to send samples. So we cannot reject the sample. We have to accept it, but we need to share with our client the residual risk that we've done everything in place to ensure that the shipment are delivered in a timely manner, but there's a risk there. So this is, I think, a good example of residual risk that we'll be sharing with the assessor when they come to visit our laboratory. And of course, you can have many more examples. Moving on to clause 6, I think we cover 4 and 5, and we still have 6, 7, and 8. So clause 6 related to personnel. Requirement for authorization of personnel to perform specific laboratory duties. I think this is one of my favorite changes in the new ISO standard because it addressed an area that I think we all failed to remember or failed to address across our laboratories. I visited so many labs. I did a lot of assessment, a lot of inspections, and I don't recall seeing a lab where when it comes to the senior tech or the lab supervisor in their training checklist or in the competency checklist, there's any mention of test method validation training or test method verification training or selection of laboratory method training or so on. So I think this is an area that most of us have overlooked, and the ISO brought it to our attention. So we need to authorize those people who are working on in test method validation, test method verification, modification of method, lab developed test, selection of method, all of those activities. We want to make sure that our staff who perform those activities are trained, competent, and it can be added to their job description, and they aware of how to do these activities. So method validation, verification, modification, and so on. So from our side, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a test method validation lecture or webinar in May. Of course, you're welcome to attend, and we'll make sure that we cover this requirement. So I don't think selection was part of this presentation, but we'll add it to it as well. So at least it can help you meet the requirement for training for method validation. Sorry, excuse me. So authorization, as I mentioned, it added in 3 different standards: 6.2.3, 7.3.1, authorized personnel shall periodically evaluate the examination method, and 7.3.3, personnel with appropriate authorization and competence shall review the validation results and record whether the result meet the specified requirement. So definitely we want to make sure that the people who are working on those processes are trained. And again, I have never seen those requirements before in any checklist. 5 elements of competency. I think we're all familiar with the 6 elements of competency, and it's one of the most cited deficiency. But now with the new ISO, so the old ISO is in the left side of the screen, the new ISO is in the right side of the screen. With the new ISO, I think we only have 5 elements of competency. So the first 2 elements on the left side of the screen, direct observation of routine work processes and procedure, and direct observation of equipment maintenance and function check, have been lumped together into direct observation of an activity. So nothing to worry about. I don't think you have to go and delete one of the 6 elements of competency. Just brought this to your attention just to be aware. Going on with clause 6.4 equipment. So now there's a requirement to have a process instead of documented procedure for the selection, procurement, acceptance, handling of equipment. So I'm very sure most of you already have a documented procedure for your equipment in the laboratory, but maybe you do not have a process. So the new ISO basically require us to have a process in place or a flow chart to explain how are we doing all those as activities. We need to have a procedure for responding to recall or other notice and taking recommended action. Many of us fail to notify the local authorities when we have a major equipment failure. So in the GCC, in many countries, there's a requirement that whenever we have a major failure, we need to notify the local authority. So we want to make sure that this is followed. So what is the difference between a process and a procedure? Because as I mentioned in the previous standard, now they require to have a process in place to explain equipment management. So a process is a set of interrelated or interacting activities that transform input into output. A process may be documented as a flow chart or a table. So basically just having a flow chart will help you meet this requirement. A procedure is a set of instructions that describe the stepwise action taken to complete activities identified in a process. When it comes to reagent, we also need to have a process instead of documented procedure for the selection, procurement, reception, storage, acceptance testing, and so on. So again, you don't have to delete or archive your SOP. All you have to do is just add a process. Reagent recall is an area of a concern, and I think many labs don't have a solid process in how to manage recall, because usually those recall notification, when the vendor send it, it goes to maybe it goes to the wrong department. Maybe the vendor will send a notification to the procurement. Maybe it should go to the laboratory manager or the QA. So we need to make sure that we have one email that to be shared with the vendor. Whenever there is a recall, it needs to be shared in that particular email. And of course, we need to have a process in place to ensure that this recall have been assessed, addressed, and it needs to be documented. Clause 6 related to externally provided product and service, here mainly in the area of referral lab. The lab shall communicate laboratory requirement to referral laboratory. Let me read it one more time. We shall communicate our requirement to referral lab. So that's a new addition to the standard. So what kind of requirement do we have that we need to communicate to the referral lab when we send out samples? I think maybe in the SLA or in the service level agreement, we need to mention what kind of expectation in terms of turnaround time. We need to mention what kind of expectation in terms of rejection rate. Maybe we want to mention to the referral lab that if there's any change in the reference range, they need to notify us ahead of time. So our IT department will have enough time to make the changes. Methodology change, they need to let us know as well. So all of this can be considered part of the communication of our requirement to the referral lab. And we already started to adapt this in our contract template to make sure that all future contract will have this. And of course, as we renew the old contract, we need to add this requirement. So of course, I recommend you to do the same, to start communicating this requirement and to start to meet with your referral lab maybe quarterly or so to evaluate the performance. Management of critical result is also added to the new requirement or to the new ISO. And actually, critical result, I still remember when it came back brought to our attention by JCI, I think in the early 2000. JCI, they have what is known as the patient safety goals. And every year they will share the most problematic areas for patient safety, and usually patient identification is there, hand washing and infection is there. And critical result came back, I think, 20 years ago. And I still remember when it came and I was working in the laboratory, we have to meet and discuss with the nursing team, with the medical team, how critical result can be communicated. And we have a call tree. If somebody didn't answer, we need to go to the next one and to the next one and so on. So it seems like this is still a problem in the healthcare industry because it's still part of the JCI patient safety goal, critical results management. So usually for a reference lab setting, because I noticed some of the participants work in reference lab, It's challenging because many times the contact, client contact that we have are not related to the medical team for those clinics or those hospitals. Usually we deal directly with the procurement department, maybe for those hospital or any department that is not medical. So in our lab, what we have to do is we have to update this contact information to make sure that whenever we have a critical result, we always have the right phone number to call the physician ASAP to make sure that the patient is safe. Because the last thing we want to have is we know about a critical result 10 at night and we don't tell the doctor until the second morning. By then, maybe the patient safety have been affected. So when it comes to management of critical results, one of the good documents we like to usually read and implement is GP47, Management of Critical and Significant Risk Result. When we did our SOP, we read this standard and we adapted most of what's written here. And I think this guideline recommended dividing the critical result into two parts. One what we call the critical result, which is, for example, a potassium, a glucose. And the second part is a significant risk result. For example, if you have a positive cancer case or positive infectious disease, those can be notified maybe within 24 hours, but a critical result needs to be maybe notified in a faster time, maybe half an hour or 1 hour. This one, I'll discuss it in more detail in future webinar when we discuss process management. I think we're going to have two different webinars, one about process management in the pre-examination phase, and one about process management at the examination and post-examination, and this will be part of the post-examination. So we'll discuss it in more details when we discuss the process management. Clause 7, process requirement for pre-examination. We all remember we used to have, there's a requirement related to request form in the old ISO. And in the request form, you expect to have the gender, the date of birth, and so on. So well, with the new ISO now, they remove this requirement for a request form. This is to recognize the various ways to order a test, because now we have a lot of electronic system. We have a health hospital information system interface with a LIS. Sometimes we have a web portal for reference lab. All of those maybe will help us with doing our requesting process without having a complete request form. And the ISO indicate that there's a statement indicating the examination request can be in any format or medium as deemed appropriate by the laboratory and acceptable by users. So basically, the recommendation from the technical committee is just to do risk assessment and decide on what need to be here in this request form, or an online request form, or if it's even a manual request form. Also discover the concept of add-on test. We know many times you will have a test in the lab, you have a tube, and then the physician will call and you will need to add on an additional test. We just need to be careful with a couple of departments, transfusion medicine, anatomic pathology, because we need to follow more restricted labeling criteria. And I think that was a recommendation by Dr. David Richters in his webinar that he'd done, I think, a couple of months ago. So I thought I'll share it with you. Still, we are in the area of reference lab, referral lab. Centrifugation, actually, in 7.2.4.4, they added requirement related to separating or dividing the primary sample when necessary. And I think I really like this addition as well, because I think it applies mainly to the clinics. So if you have a small clinic in a rural area, many times they don't have a centrifuge, so they will collect a sample from a patient at 10 in the morning, and then the logistic vehicle will come at 3 p.m. to collect a sample, and the sample is unspun, and of course the result will be impacted. Maybe even if they have a centrifuge, maybe it was not set up in the right speed. Maybe it's not calibrated. Even if they have a refrigerator, are they saving the sample in the right temperature? So generally, the new requirement for separating or dividing the primary sample when necessary, I think we need to really look into that, especially if you are a referral lab and you have a lot of clients. We need to make sure that all of our clients have centrifuges. They know how to spin it, how to balance it. If they don't know, maybe we need to train them. And maybe we need to ensure that their centrifuge is calibrated so that we will eliminate any pre-analytical errors. We all know that the most common cause of error in the lab are pre-analytical. So I think this is an area of interest to the new ISO, and I like it because from my experience, I noticed that there's a number of issues when it comes to pre-analytic, especially in the area of centrifugation and temperature monitoring in the pre-analytic phase of testing. Moving on to clause 7.3. There's a shift on terminology. We used to use the terminology interlaboratory comparison. Now we use external quality assessment, so they changed the name from ILC to EQA. And initially I thought this is just a change in terminology, but when I discussed this with the team from CLSI who visited Dubai last month, they brought to our attention that EQA is totally different. It's a program. So with the program, we have to do evaluation. We need to see if this PT program fit for purpose. Do they have, let's say, enough positive and negative sample? Do they share the evaluation in a timely manner? How is the temperature often received, and so on? So definitely, I think when we cover in future webinar, the proficiency testing part, we will explain more what is expectation from ISO. But I just want to highlight and bring to your attention, this is not only change in terminology, but change in the way that we look at it. So it's not a matter of just ordering a proficiency testing from a PT provider, but it's a matter of having a full program for proficiency testing. Quality control. Quality control is, I recall the technical committee mentioned that this was the most challenging area of the new ISO standard because it's very controversial. And to be honest, the changes I see there, it's very logical. So 7.3.7.2, the procedure should allow for the detection of either lot-to-lot reagent or calibrator variation or both of the examination method. So basically, what they want us to do is if you change the reagent, you should not change the control lot number at the same time. If you change the calibrator, you should not change the control lot number at the same time. And that's, I think, very logical, but maybe some people forget that and they will change everything together. And then if there's any drift in your system, you will not know the reason for that drift. So to me, to be in compliance with this one, the way I'm looking at it is just maybe I'll add that to the SOP, QC SOP. So at least my lab staff will know that they should not change everything at the same time, one thing at a time. So in case of any failure, they will know the reason for the for the failure. I'll add that to my training checklist. I'll add that to the competency assessment checklist. Hopefully that will meet the intent of the standard, but definitely here at Unilabs, we're going to discuss this in the task force, and usually every standard is a chameleon. We discuss it, we look at it from various angles, and we see how we need to be in compliance with this one. The standard in the right side of the screen, C, again 7.3.7.2, I think it's more applicable to resource limited setting. I know many of the participants here are from Africa as well, and I know I worked in Africa for many years with the NIH, working in research, vaccine trial, malaria vaccine trial, and other part of Africa. And I recall the challenges that usually we face when it comes to receiving QC in a timely manner, especially CBC QC. Also reagent, many times when we are in a very rural area, by the time the reagent come to us, it's not in the right temperature. So there's a lot of challenges in resource limited setting. And I think the new ISO requirement C will give those resource limited setting area options, or plan B. If you have a proper QC in place, you can have alternative. So 1, 2, and 3 are alternative for not having a QC, retesting of retained patient samples, comparison of result for patient sample on a specified schedule with the previous result, and trend analysis of patient results with moving average. And actually, this is interesting to me because most of the publication in the area of moving average, they will talk about moving average as a complementary to the QC. But I have never seen at that time, before this new ISO publication, that discuss using moving average in place of the QC. So I thought I'll just share with you some of the old publication. I think it started back in 65, the average of normal or moving average. Then Westgard have a publication back in 84, assessment of average of normal. And then another publication in 1996, Design and Assessment of Average of Normal. So all of those publications discuss how you can use patient moving average to monitor and the quality of your testing system. Another good publication that was published, and again, all of those publications, when I read it, it discuss how you can use the moving average, patient moving average, as a complementary to your existing QC practice, not a replacement. But I think it's a good one. I spoke about it in a previous conference, and I kind of like it, but I think it only fit big settings, big labs with thousands of tests, because to monitor the patient moving average, you need big number of samples. I think this publication from LabCorp in 2014, they said you need 50 samples. So every 50 sample, you will average it. And then the next 50 sample, you'll average it. And then you'll see if there's any drift beyond the total allowable error. Then maybe you need to pull the QC out of the refrigerator and you can run it, and then you will know that there's an issue. And usually all of those are used in some sort of algorithmic way or data innovation software to detect those errors. And I think I really like it, but it will not fit for most of the people in this call, because most of us are working in a small or a medium-sized labs, and it's not easy to implement. But for a large-sized lab, definitely the use of moving average is recommended. But now with the new ISO, we need to do a lot of reading in how can we use moving average in replacement of a QC. And when I start to read about it, to be honest, in the last 3 years, there's a number of good publications discuss how you can do that. So I think we just need to be familiar with how we can do it. And in case if we ever have to run a test without having a third-party control or a manufacturer control, we need to have a process in place on how we can use those methods to ensure the quality of our laboratory results. Another change here in 7.4, post-examination process, is revised report. So on the left side of the screen is the ISO 2012 revised report. That's the terminology the old ISO was using. In the middle side of the screen, ISO 15189-2022, now amended to reported results. So procedure for the issue of amended or revised results. So now ISO is using both amended and revised. I think we all know the word amended. We use it a lot in the anatomic pathology department. The word revised, we use it, of course, we can use it in clinical pathology department. But I just want to highlight to you the College of American Pathologists, GEN, checklist 41310, they use the term corrected report. So I think there's a misalignment here in terms of the terminology, because the ISO use revised and the CAB use corrected. So in our policy, we need to put both, I think, to make both of them happy. So we'll use corrected, slight, revised report. And just I want to highlight to you, we are not talking about correction of record. So for example, if you wrote the wrong temperature and then you have to correct it to the right temperature, that's different. So that's correction of record. Here we're talking about changing patient results. So with the new ISO, they just added the word amended, and I think that will fit well with anatomic pathology. And as I mentioned, corrected or revised can be used in clinical pathology, and I think that's what we're going to use in our laboratory. Requirement for reports also have changed a little bit. 7. Or report attribute 7.4.1.6. Now the ISO is pushing for the use of lawing codes. So lawing code is a common language, set of identifiers, names, and code for identifying health measurement results and document. Basically, it's every test will have a way to write the name and a code or a number, and that usually help with trending patient results. So, for example, if you have a EMR in the country level, if we are using a lawing code, then you can trend patient results over time to see how these results are moving or changing. Are they progressing in a better way, or is the patient deteriorating, or so on? So the use of lawing code will be helpful, especially with the EMR. So here in the UAE, in the Emirates of Abu Dhabi, under the Health Information Exchange standard number 5, patient laboratory results information, there's a requirement for the use of lawing code. During Arab Health Conference last month, we discussed with the team and from DH, and they're very happy with the fact that many hospitals start to implement lawing code across the Emirates. Also in Europe, I think our chief technology officer was here last month during MedLab, and he mentioned that many of our laboratories now across Europe are started to implement Loyang codes, and I think he started with the send out because it's might be very important when you send out a sample. All laboratories speaking the same language. So when we discuss this standard, which is clause 7, definitely I'll ask him to, if he's available, to come and speak to us maybe for 10 minutes about the experience on the implementation of Loyang code and the challenges, and hopefully that will help all of us implement Loyang code in our laboratory. Moving on with information management 7.6.3, the new ISO have requirement related to cybersecurity. So they added the word cybersecurity. Again, here, since I'm presenting from the United Arab Emirates, we have local regulation related to cybersecurity. It's called ADIC, Abu Dhabi Healthcare Information and Cybersecurity Standard. It's a public document. Since I know that in this call we have people from 50 different countries, even if you are not in here in the UAE, you can download it for free, and it's not a bad idea to share it with your IT and HR department because it's free, public, and it has on the right side an implementation guideline. So you can download the implementation as well, and it will help you implement it in your laboratory. And in this document, actually, it consists of not only, as I mentioned, IT. So they have IT-related requirement related to access control, access to the server room, how you provide access to new stuff, and so on. And it also addresses HR requirement as well. Some of the HR requirement related to background check and so on. And our lab was just inspected, I think, a couple of months ago and received the certificate. And I'm very sure most of the labs in the Emirates of Abu Dhabi already have this certificate because it's a very actually detailed audit, but it's helpful. And I think the advice here is when we talk about audit in the future, I'll have a webinar about audits and internal audit. Many people tend to forget the non-technical department, and we want to make sure that we have a checklist to audit the non-technical department, and that audit checklist should not only consist of the ISO standard or the CAB standard, but we need to add other local regulations. So we plan, when we complete the non-technical department audit checklist, definitely we'll add anything from the ADICs to our internal audit. So when we have our internal audit within our laboratory, we will ensure compliance not only with ISO or CAB, we ensure compliance with this local regulation. Complaints. So in the area of complaint, there is a big expansion in that section in terms of how we handle complaint. And there's a requirement now for the complaint process to be publicly available. So how can we make it publicly available? I'm thinking maybe we should use it in the directory of service. We can add it there. We can also add it maybe to our website. But there are like three different standards now or clauses related to complaints. First one, B, we need to track and record the complaint, including action taken to resolve the complaint. We need to ensure appropriate action is taken. Description of the process for handling complaints shall be publicly available, as I mentioned, so we need to post it somewhere. In terms of tracking and assessing and evaluating complaint, I think that's a common practice, especially here, people in the GCC areas, because it's a service industry. So I think most of us will have a very robust complaint process, but if your complaint process or complaint resolution process is not robust enough, definitely I recommend to read all those requirements to make sure that the complaints are addressed in the right way, and of course as soon as possible. Also, there's a requirement whenever possible, the laboratory shall acknowledge the receipt of complaint. So many of us will have like a token system or a tracking number that usually once you send the complaint, it will come to you with the number, so you can follow with that number. And some labs are more personal in terms of respond to complaint. You will have an email from them. So definitely all of those will help to meet the intent of this requirement. To safeguard impartiality, they want to make sure that the person who handled the complaint is not the same person who is subject to the complaint in question, whenever appropriate or when possible. The old ISO, I put it in the right side of the screen, the ISO 2012. So the complaint clause was very small, but of course in the new ISO you have 3 different parts. So definitely we need to look into it, and we want to make sure that we bring our laboratory to compliance with this one. Clause 7, related to business continuity, I think there's more emphasis now in disaster management and business continuity. And I think they said often contracts that are set up with financial penalties for non-delivery of service are there, but we should be more focused on maintaining the service. So let's say if the vendor did not deliver the reagent on time, we will penalize them financially, but what's going to happen to our patient samples? So we want to make sure we have a process in place to continue the delivery of services during that time. So I also recommend the use of CLSI GP36 planning for laboratory operation during a disaster. From my side, I recommend, in addition to that, I recommend the business continuity standard for ISO. I think most of us have read this standard, especially during COVID time. ISO 22301. It has a lot of details in terms of how we can manage disaster, how we can have a disaster preparedness plan, and how we can do business impact analysis and so on. And if you want a document for free, I definitely recommend the NCMA standard, the National Standard for Business Continuity Management System. You can take a screen print of it. You can just download it as well. It's available for free. They have 2 different documents. One was published, I think, back in 2015, and then this one is published in 2022. It was published by, in Arabic, المجلس الأعلى للأمن الوطني. الهيئة الوطنية لإدارة الطوارئ والأزمات والكوارث. I think it's a good document because it will help you with understanding the ISO 22301 and the implementation part. I think maybe we'll cover business continuity at the future lecture as well. So what is business continuity? Is the capability of an organization to continue the delivery of product and services within acceptable time frames at a predefined capacity during a disruption. Regardless of the size of the organization, we have to have a business continuity process in place. And I think PwC did a survey, and they said 7 in every 10 leaders have experienced at least one corporate crisis in the last 5 years. So definitely having a robust business continuity in place will be helpful. And we need to see what kind of disaster we expect in our laboratory or in our area. Maybe if you are in a hurricane area, you have to prepare for a hurricane disaster hurricane plan. If you are in an earthquake area, you need to prepare for what to do in the laboratory or in the hospital in case of earthquake, and so on. So definitely addressing or having a business continuity plan is advisable. When we did this a couple of years ago during COVID, we reached out to most of the vendors, and it caught me by surprise to find most of the vendors are either accredited by the ISO business continuity standard, or they are already in compliance with the business continuity requirement. However, we want to make sure that we are aligned between us and the vendor to ensure the continuity of business and the flow of reagent and equipment to our laboratory. Last clause, I think it's what time now? We have about 8 minutes or so to finish. I think we'll finish on time. Last clause number 8.1, management system documentation. So they remove the requirement for a quality manual. However, the information need to be available. Therefore, most of the assessor, most of the people who wrote about the new ISO standard, they recommend that we continue using the quality manual. But it is no longer a requirement. Requirement to communicate, that's clause 8.5, requirement to communicate to personnel action arising from their feedback. So sometimes the laboratory staff will share their feedback with the HR or with the management. So we need to come back to them and mention to them the fact that your feedback have been heard and what we have done about it. So in our lab here next week, our CEO will have a breakfast with the staff, and email was sent to all our staff. If you want to have a breakfast with the CEO on the 20th, you can just request your seat, and then they will sit with him, and they will discuss with him any concern. And then usually a couple of weeks later, and the HR will share an email with everyone of what were the concern and how it has been addressed. Some leadership team, they will walk around once a month C-suite will walk around, and then they will come back to the staff and they will say, you said this and we have done this. Maybe you complain about the cafeteria working hours, we increase the cafeteria working hours, or so on. And of course, most of our labs, most of the labs here, as long as well as our lab, will have annual employee satisfaction survey, and usually that's more, of course, comprehensive, and the feedback will be provided to the staff as well. So there are different ways to be in compliance with this requirement, and I'm very sure most of the laboratories are already having this process in place. Now, what are the next steps? So I give you a quick overview of the new ISO, and I think now you have a test of what you have to work with in a very short timeline. I think we only have maybe 7 or 8 months to go. And if you subtract the summer vacation and people will be traveling during the summer, you only have like 5 or 6 months. So a lot of work, as you can see, with the new structure. So the next step, what is my recommendation from my side? First, we need to understand the local accreditation body timelines for accreditation. And I think you heard here, if you're in the UAE, you heard what Khawla mentioned in terms of the timeline. And of course, most of the accrediting agency, I know many of you are in different parts of the world, you will go to the accrediting agency website, you will receive email in terms of timeline to compliance, in terms of training, in terms of, as she mentioned earlier, the local, the complementary documents to the ISO will be changed and so on. So we need to keep an eye of what's happening from the local accreditation body. Of course, we need to purchase the new ISO. It's a copyright document. We need to read it and understand the changes. We need to perform gap analysis and assign responsibilities. Not everything I mentioned is a gap in your lab. If you're already having a local accreditation and you have CAB accreditation, most likely you already have a process in place, but yet most likely you're going to have some gap, maybe in the area of impartiality, maybe in the area of aligning your quality manual. So definitely you need to find your gap, and you need to put timeline to address this gap. You need to train your staff in the new ISO. So I'm going to use this material that I'm preparing, and in addition to the 7 future webinar, to train our staff on the new ISO and how are we in our laboratory setting are we're going to be in compliance with the new ISO. And maybe the quality manager can go to the training that held by the local accreditation body. We need to update the quality manual and align all of our procedure with the quality manual, because I know most of your quality manual, of course, quality manual can be written in 2 different ways. You can follow it by quality system essential, or you can follow the ISO standard, one standard on a time. And I think most of the people will use the second approach, which is follow the ISO standard. Clause 4 and 5, it will be addressed in your quality manual. Well, now you have to restructure the entire quality manual. So instead of clause 4 and 5, we have to do clause 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So the first thing we have to do is just realigning things, move the service agreement to the right place, move the pre-examination to the right place, and then we need to add anything new requirement to the quality manual. So just the quality manual by itself, I think it's going to take us a good couple of weeks to update it after we update all of our SOP. So it's a lot of work. And of course, at the last step here, we need to communicate changes to the management system to our laboratory staff. In summary, I think I covered everything here. I don't have to go through it because I want to allow more time for interaction. We're going to very shortly open the camera, and we're going to have Ryan talking about how you can get your CME and so on. But generally, this is what I covered in this presentation. Those are my references. And I think there's a couple of references I did not discuss, but I really encourage you to go to some of the good website, which I like to go to and find some useful information. So UCAS is a good one. They publish a transition document template that you can use now. You don't have to wait for your local accreditation body to share the document. You can use the UCAS one. It's not bad at all. Also, British Standard Institute, they have executive briefing, and I think most of what I just discussed, it's listed in that one. Another good website, SANAS, South African National Accreditation System. We have EAC here. There's a number of good local accreditation body websites where you can find very useful resources to comply with the ISO standard. I think I'll talk about it in the future, but definitely the one that I just mentioned, maybe it's a good start. As I mentioned earlier, those are the future presentation we're going to have here as part of Unilab Academic and Research Department. They're all going to be for free. We will try to accredit all of them by by the local for CME, and we'll, of course, we'll distribute certificate for those who are attended. And thank you so much.